Hi guys, Dennis here and welcome to my series on iOS development. In this short video, we're going to build an app that will calculate the number of days and months between two dates that we'll set from a date picker. It's pretty simple, but it has some methods that you'll need to be familiar with for your projects. So let's get started. So let's go ahead and open up Xcode and we're going to create a new project. And as always, I like to start with an empty application. So we'll click Next. And we'll make this project, or we'll call this project rather, Working with Dates. And we can leave the class prefix blank, but make sure devices have been set to iPhone. Click Next and Create. And we have a project. So first order of business, let's right-click on our project navigator and click New File, and we're going to add a storyboard. So go to User Interface, Storyboard, Next, and make sure device family is set. Click Next again, and we're going to call this storyboard main storyboard. Click Create, and we have our storyboard. Now it's off to the app delegate M file, to the first method, which is the application did finish launching with options. And since we're using a storyboard, we can delete all the code excluding the return statement. Alright, let's go back to our project, and under deployment information we're going to set the storyboard as our main interface, like so. Okay, while we're here in our project navigator, let's go ahead and right click once again, create a new file. And we're going to create the class file that we'll be needing. So we'll select Cocoa Touch, Objective-C class, Next, and we're just going to call this Dates View Controller, and make sure it's a subclass of UI View Controller. Then we'll click Next and Create, and we have our class file. Now we're ready to jump into our storyboard, and what we want to do first is add an instance of UI View Controller. So we'll grab that, put that on a storyboard, and let's embed that into a navigation controller, like so. And that will give us, among other things, a nav bar, and we'll go ahead and double click and put a title in there, and we'll just call it Dates for short. Okay, while we're here, let's click on the View Controller and go to our Identity Inspector and assign our class file to this controller, which was the Dates View Controller class file. Now we're ready to add the objects that we'll need, and the first one we'll need is a date picker. So let's go down to our object library and do a search on date picker, and there it is. And we'll drag an instance of that onto our view controller and just snug it up right underneath our nav bar. Okay, let's do a couple things to that. We'll go to the Identity Inspector. And the first thing we want to do is set the mode. It defaults to date and time. We want to change that to date only. And this is very important, otherwise you're going to get some strange information. Okay, now that we have that done, we can go ahead and add the other objects. That's the only thing that we need to do with this guy. So let's add a couple of labels, and we'll put them right below there, like so. There's one. And we need one more, like so. And let's make those labels, we probably need them about 132, I would imagine. So let's go to the Size Inspector, and we'll select both of these. And we're unable, we'll have to do it one at a time here. So let's change that to about 132, because we want to make sure that we can see the entire date. And then next thing we need to do, we'll go back to the Attributes Inspector. Let's get rid of the text that's currently in there, like so. And actually, let's go ahead and we'll bump the font size down to, let's say, 15, and that will make sure that we'll be able to fit the text that we need in there, like so. Okay, now that we have our two labels, and these labels are going to display our to date and our from date, now we need a segmented control. So we'll do a search there, Let's drag that guy on there and put that right in the middle. And we'll go up to the segment, and segment 0, which is the first segment, is entitled First. We want to change that to From. And then we'll use the drop-down list and change the second segment, which is segment number 1. These are integers here. And we're going to change that title to 2. Now, using the segmented control, we'll be able to determine which label we want to populate with our date information. Okay, the next thing we need is a button that we're going to use to perform our calculation. So let's drag that on right about so. Like that. And let's change the title of that button to Calculate. And I think we'll change the background color, so we need to scroll down to View, and let's go to Background, and let's change it from default to, let's make our button green, like so. And as a matter of fact, while we're doing colors, let's go ahead and change, we can select both of these at the same time, and change the color to yellow, the background of our labels. That way they'll be easily distinguishable. Okay, we need one more label to display our results. So let's do a search on label once again, and we'll drag that, and this time we're going to make that the width of our view controller here. Like so. And we'll get rid of the text, and we'll change the background color to that as well. Background, and we'll change that to yellow. Okay, I think we're ready to build and run, see what we have. But before we do, notice that our display is set to 3.5 inch. Let's go ahead and change that to 4 inch. That'll give us a little bit more real estate to work with. Now we're ready to build and run it and see what we have. Okay, that looks pretty good. Our date picker is showing the date, the month, the day, and the year. We have our two labels. We have our segmented control, our calculate button, and our answer label. So everything looks good here. So I think we're ready to start building, or start adding rather, our properties. So let's do that now. We'll close out our utility panel and select our controller and open up our assistant editor and change our view to our header. And we're going to need some room here, so let's do that. Okay. So the first thing we need is our UI date picker, so control drag. And this is an outlet, and we're just going to call this date picker. Now we'll create properties for our two labels. And this first one will be our from label. And the second one will be our to label. And now we need a property for our segmented control. And we'll call this segmented control. And we need a property for our answer label. Like so. Now we need a couple of actions. One with our date picker. And we'll change that to IB action. And we're going to name this did change date. And I like to change the type to date picker and connect. And we need one more for our calculate button. And we'll call this, first of all, we'll change it to IB action. And we'll call this calculate. And we'll change the type to button. And that should do it for our properties. So it's off to our implementation file, and we can go ahead and close out our editor, and we'll jump over there. And the first thing we want to do is add a couple of properties that we're going to need to perform our number of days between date calculations. These will in essence be our date variables. These two properties will hold the raw NSDate information. So let's create a property. This will be a non-atomic and strong, and this will be an NSDate. And this first guy will be from date, and we'll just copy that and create another one, and we'll just make a slight change, and this will be our to date, like so. And we can go ahead and synthesize those two properties. Okay. So now we're ready to code our viewDidLoad method. So let's scroll up and get rid of our comment and give ourselves a little bit of room because we're going to need it. So what we want to do here is set the text property of our two text fields to the current date. This will be like a default setting when the view controller first loads, and we'll also define our from date and our to date variables. So we'll need to define the format that we want our date to be in. So first we'll allocate and initialize a date formatter. So let's do that. So that'll be an NSDate formatter, and that's right there. And we'll just call this guy formatter. And then we'll do an NSDate formatter, and we'll do an alloc and an init. And that takes care of that guy. And then we're going to set the format. And we can get our format by searching for Unicode formats using Google. And actually, we want to do a search on Unicode date formats. Let's open up our browser. And we're just going to type Unicode date formats. And actually this first one is perfect, the UTS number 35, Unicode Locale Data Markup Language. So let's select that guy. And we have our file here. Let's scroll down and see what we get here. And under parts, we look at all the different parts, and part 4 has dates, date, time, time zone, formatting. That's the guy that we want. So let's click there. And now we have a table of contents. So let's scroll down through here and see if there's anything worth clicking on. And we have our date format patterns, and that's exactly what we're looking for here. So we can click on that. And now we have our patterns. And if you look here at the second pattern, this is pretty useful here. This is a medium pattern. Gives us our day, abbreviated, our month, the date, and the year, which is abbreviated. So let's just go ahead and copy that like so. We'll do a Command C. Then we can get out of our browser, and we're going to need that in a moment here. So let's go ahead and use our formatter. And then we want to use call the set date format, and that's the top one. And then we need an @ parentheses, and then we're just going to do a Command V and paste what we just copied in there, and make sure that we finish it off with a close parenthesis, and that's our format style right there. Okay, so now that we have our format defined, we need to define our time zone. So once again, this is very similar to the above. We go formatter, and then we use a set time zone. And that's the second guy here. So we need a bracket and then an NS time zone. And then we want to use just the local time zone. Okay, so next we'll set the two text fields so that they display the current date when the view first loads. So we need to create two strings, and we'll need to convert NSDates to strings in order to display the values in our text fields. So let's create the first string here, NSString, and we're going to call this the FromDate string. And here we need to use our formatter that we just created, formatter, and then we use the string from date method. And of course our date is we're going to get our date from our date picker, so that'll be a self.datepicker.date, like so. The next one, same thing, and a string. And this one, I bet you can guess, it's going to be the toDate string. And then we can just copy this method right here because it's going to be exactly the same thing, like so. Okay, we have our strings done. Now we can set the text properties to those strings. So the first text will be an underscore, and that's a from label dot text, and that equals the from date string. And then same thing, to label dot text equals the to date string, like so. And finally, we'll set the initial value of our two NSDate variables, and we'll be using our number of that we'll be using for our number of days calculation. And we're just going to set those initially to the current date, so when the view first loads, all our variables have information. So the from date, make sure we select the NSDate equals self.datepicker.date. And then the to date equals the same thing, like so. So why don't we go ahead and build and run now, just to make sure that we have what we need to have when the view first loads. So we'll build and run. And looks good. It defaults both the from and to the current date. So it doesn't make any changes yet because we haven't coded the picker did change event, but we have our date information, current date, in both our from box, or our from label rather, and our to label. So it looks good so far. So now we're ready to code our did change date method, and that fires each time the user spins the date picker. So let's go ahead and make ourselves some room, and we'll scroll down to the did change date method, and we're going to need some room here, so let's do that. Okay, so let's review what we want to accomplish here. We need to update the text fields and our date variables each time the user changes the date picker, and we'll make those changes based upon which position the segmented control is in. The from position obviously changes the from date, and the to position changes the to date. So once again, we need to start with an instance of date formatter. So instead of writing all that out, we can just go up and copy, and actually we're going to need the first 3 lines of our view did load method. So we're going to copy the date formatter and the set date format. Remember that we had to go to Google to find, and our time zone. Let's go ahead and do a Command C, and we'll go ahead and paste those in our did change method, and like so. Okay, so this time we only need a single string. You remember in the view did load method we created 2 strings, one for our from date string and one for our to date string. But this time we only need a single string because we're going to use a switch statement to determine whether we're setting the from date or the to date. So let's create our string and a string, and we'll just call this a formatted date, like so. And we use our formatter that we just created, and once again we call the string from date, and this once again we'll grab this from our date picker, so that'll be a self.datepicker.date. Okay, so now we need to write a switch statement to determine which text box and variable we're trying to set. So we do a switch, and we're going to switch on what's called the selected segment index. And you recall from, we can jump back over there real quick just to take a look at it. Open up our utilities panel and go to our segmented control, and we have a segmented index here, index 0 and index 1 in our case. And if we had a 4 segmented switch, we'd have 4 segments. But that's where we get this information. So let's jump back up to our view controller, M file, and we're going to do a self.segmented control, and then we do a selected segment index. That's the guy that we're going to be switching on. So our first case will be the first case, our first integer, and that will be a case 0. And we're going to need two statements in here. In other words, if the switch has been set to the from, we're going to execute the next two statements. And the first thing we're going to do is set the text from the from label. So that'll be an underscore from label dot text, and we get that from our formatted date. You recall that we need to use the formatted date because the raw information is NSDate form. So formatted date like so. Now the next statement that we do, we're setting the from date NSDate variable, and we get that by doing the from date, and that is self.datePicker.date. Okay, so the first guy is done. Now we need a case 1, and we're basically going to do the same thing, so why don't we just copy these two guys like so. But we got to make a couple of changes. Instead of the from label, this is the to label, and instead of the from date, this is going to be the to date. Okay, just so you understand what's going on here, if the switch is in the first position, which is the from, we're going to execute these two statements. We're going to update our text label using our formatted date, and then we're going to update our from date NSDate variable using what we grabbed from the date picker itself. And then basically the same thing happens if we're in the second position, which is case number 1, which is the to date. So let's go ahead and build and run and make sure that we have coded this correctly. Let's get rid of all our empty white space here, and we'll go ahead and run it. And it should default to the current date, both the to and from label, which it does. So right now the segmented control is set to from, so we ought to be able to spin this and the from date changes, which it does. We can see that it's changing now to different months, and the dates are working. Alright, so now let's switch over to the to, and this time the to date label should be changing, which it does. Okay, so far so good. Okay, so we have one last method to code, and that's our calculate method. So let's make ourselves some room here so I can bring it up a little bit, make it easier for you to see. And the first thing we need to do here is to define which calendar we're working with, and in our case we're using a Gregorian calendar, so we need to do an alloc and an init. So we'll use an ns calendar, and we'll just call our calendar calendar, and we do an ns calendar alloc, and then an init with calendar identifier. And our identifier, as I indicated, is going to be the Gregorian calendar, so we need to do a search on that. NS Gregorian calendar right there. Like so. Okay, so next we need a flag which will be used to define which calendar unit we're working with. And in our case, we want to work with days unit. And these flags are integers, so to follow Apple's example, we're going to use an unsigned integer. And FYI, an unsigned integer can only represent positive numbers, whereas a signed integer can represent both positive or negative numbers. So let's create our flag. So that's an unsigned int, and we're just going to call this unit flags. Actually, unit flag for short here. and we need the day calendar unit, so NSDate calendar unit right there, like so. Now if you end up getting some strange information displayed, this is the first place I'd look to make sure that you have the correct unit set. And you're going to want to make sure that you have the correct unit for each value you want. In other words, if you were displaying months and days, you'd need to have both those units separated by the pipe bar. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here a little bit later when we go to expanding what kind of information you can extract. So the next thing we need to do is split out our date into components, and we'll use our flag to tell our method that we're working with the day calendar unit. So let's do an NSDate component, like so, and we'll just call this components equals calendar components. And then the first thing it's asking for is the component, and as I indicated, we want to use the day calendar unit, so we're just going to put the unit flag in there, which will tell our method that we're working with days. And now our from date is going to be the from date NSDate variable that we're using, so that'll be from, and then the to date will be our to date, and the options we can just set as 0. So let's take care of that guy. Okay. So now we need to create an integer to hold the value of days, the number of days that we get from the method that we just created here. So let's just do a quick integer, and we'll call this guy days equals bracket components, what we created above here, and we want the day value. And now we need to assign the information that we just extracted to our text box. So that will be a self.answerLabel.text, and that'll be equal to string, and then we want to do a string with format, and then we can write out some information here. We'll do an @ and then we'll just say number of days is, and we'll do a %, and then we have to use the integer, close parentheses, and then our data source is our days component, or our days integer that we just created above. So we'll use that as our data source here, like so. Okay, I think we're ready to build and run, see what we have here. Okay, we know everything works here, so we have our from date. Let's set our to date, and we'll set it for, currently it's on the 28th, let's set it to the 30th, and then we'll hit the calculate button. Number of days is 2, so everything's working, 28, 29, 30th. And we can do this backwards if we want. Let's go back, and we'll set the from date, and we'll go backwards in time. Let's go back to March of 2012, for example, and then our to date is Saturday, November 30th. We'll calculate again, and the number of days is 641. And we can play around with this a little bit. June 28th, 2012, and we'll set the to date to August 30th, and let's make this 2016, for example, and we'll calculate, and the number of days is 1524. So it looks like it's working fine. Would like to dress up the interface a little bit. Let's center all these labels here. So let's go to our main storyboard, and we'll open up our utilities panel, and we'll select all these, and we'll center the text, And let's try that. I bet that looks a little bit better. Okay, that looks a little bit nicer. Let's go to a 2 and we'll make a January 2014. Calculate. Number of days is 61. Okay, so that looks good. We can stop that. And let's go back to our implementation file. And let's make some subtle changes to explore some of the other ways that we can display data. So currently, we're just extracting the day calendar unit. But let's say that we want to show our information with month and days. So let's make a couple of subtle changes here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add months. So that'll be an NS month calendar unit. And then we need to separate it with the pipe and then an NS day calendar unit. Now we have 2 calendar units that are included in our unit flag. So what else do we need to do? Well, we need to make another change down here. We have the components, we have the day component, so we need another integer to represent our month. So int, and that'll be months equals components month, like so. Okay, we need to make a minor change to our answer string. So let's make a change here, and we can say the number of months, and then we'll do a placeholder and an I, and then the number of days, and then a placeholder and an I. And so we need 2 data sources, and the first one will be months and the second one will be days. Well, let's build and run and see what we have now. Okay, so we have Thursday, November 28th, and let's change the 2 to October 31st, 2014. And now we'll calculate. And the number, okay, we need some more room here, so we're going to have to make a couple of changes. Looks like I need to change the capitalization there, so let's fix that. So that should be number. And then let's go over to our label, and we'll bump the size of that text down a little bit so we can display everything. Let's bump it down to 12, and that should do it. Oop. Okay, let's try to run that again. See if we have enough room this time. Okay, let's try that again. 2, and we'll do a July 30th, 2014, and we'll do a calculate. And the number of months, 8, the number of days, 2. So that works. And we can explore it a little bit further here. Let's change our from, and we'll go back in time here to March 2005. So we're from Wednesday, March 05 to Wednesday, July 30th, 14. We'll do calculate. Number of months, 112. The number of days is 0, which is perfect. So everything is working now. So let's stop that. We'll go back to our M. So as I indicated, you can play around. You could add units. So right now we've added the month calendar unit and the day calendar unit. I could add the hour calendar unit, the seconds, and whatever I add in this unit flag, I have to do a corresponding statement right below, and then of course I have to change my answer statement here. So that pretty much wraps it up. Okay, so as I said, that pretty much wraps it up for this short video. It was meant as an introduction to using NSDate. As you can now know for yourself, there are many components of NSDate that you can extract and perform calculations to and then display. I'll leave it to you to explore these different settings on your own. I really appreciate all your comments and your thumbs up, so keep them coming. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.